So we're going to open the floor to questions. Please identify yourself. There's a microphone stand and back, and for the front tables, there's a mobile microphone. I saw a woman with her hand there. Yeah. Yes, please. And identify yourself, please.
Sorry. Hi, thank you. My name is Lisa Friedman. I'm a reporter with E&E News, Energy and Environment News. Sir, next week you're preparing to host the Bali Breakfast Finance Ministers gathering to discuss the ongoing climate negotiations. I'm wondering if finance ministers are not understandably occupied these days with the financial crisis, and I'm hoping you could speak to how the fragile economic state is affecting not just your agenda on climate change at the Bali Breakfast and at the meetings, but the ongoing UN negotiations. Thank you.
Sure. Well, the good news was, as I mentioned in my remarks, last week we had a pledging session, and those countries still came forward with $6.1 billion, which is a hefty sum and just the start of what we'll need. But your question enables me to expand a little bit on the remarks, in particular, give you an insight as to why we created this Bali Breakfast. In 91 and 92, I led the U.S. Team in the climate change negotiations for Rio. My then boss, Secretary Baker, recused himself because he owned oil stocks, so I had the pleasure of dealing with this. And one of the insights that I drew in those negotiations was most of the negotiations are done by environmental ministries or foreign ministries. So the economic engagement was modest. Most striking was my sense at that time that getting people to consider trading markets at all was a big, big step. And in fact, our European partners didn't want to even consider sinks as well as sources. And so from that time forward, I've always thought it was important to try to engage the economic community with the environmental community, as I suggested today, the energy community. Because of that, when Indonesia hosted the climate change meeting last year, I spoke to President Yudhoyono and to Sri Mulyani, the finance minister, encouraged them to have a meeting of finance and development ministers to further engage them in the topic. It was also wonderful that it was hosted in a developing country, because all of us know to deal with the issue of climate change, you're going to have developing countries involved. Developing countries have anxieties. We have to connect this to a larger development strategy. Based on that, I talked with Sri Mulyani and others and thought that we should hold a meeting at each of our spring and annual meetings to focus on climate change, but in a little different way than these meetings normally occur. We didn't want to just do a tour of the table with commenting on something. We try to use these meetings to dig into a topic. And the first one we had in the spring meeting was on adaptation. This one we're focusing on carbon trading. And the relation of this to your question was that having worked with and known a number of these ministers, I know that many of them are quite interested in the topic, but they never have a few 2 or 3 hour sessions to really dig into the subject, to have somebody, I've met with people from McKinsey and others to come and give sort of an overview of the carbon trading issue. So what we've tried to do is, in fact, just this weekend I was pretty much finishing up a PowerPoint. I try to do a presentation that will give them a sharp view of the relation of carbon markets to climate change, why it's important, what it needs to do to work better, and some of the key questions that they as finance and development ministers will need to face. There's a little bit of sense of how the World Bank may help. So in a world where you have a lot of busy people under the pressure of crises, in a way, one of the roles, and it fills out some of the language I put in here, that an international institution can play, is to help synthesize, shape, simplify some of these issues and frame them for the decision makers and point out that you're not going to have effective carbon markets, for example, unless you make some decisions. And for people who have a financial market tilt, I'm actually showing how the markets in some ways would look like exchange rate markets that you can't trade the currencies, and the effect of that in having a more liquid and a deep financial market. So it's a wonderful example in a small way of how we need to connect economics and finance and development to the climate change agenda, and do so in a way that I hope will shape some questions for people as they look towards the UNFCCC negotiations.
That's great. Thank you. Okay. Nancy Birdsall, and then I've got 4 more. We may not even get to you all, but we'll try. Nancy.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very dense speech, as Adam indicated. I'd like to make one quick comment and then raise a more metaphysical kind of question. The comment is, as you know, we've been urging the bank to move faster on setting a price for carbon, a shadow price, at least in the potential projects in which it invests. So I just hope that many of your comments will be conveyed to your colleagues inside the bank in thinking more quickly about that particular issue. On the metaphysical side, I think this speech will go down as very important, this idea of modern 21st century multilateralism. I was thinking as you were talking about it that we did have 20th century multilateralism, which benefited tremendously from the reality that for most of the period after World War II, we had a benign hegemon on the 1 billion people multilateralism, which was the United States. And it seems to me that September, October of 2008 may represent the moment when we all become more aware that we may not have in the same way in the 4 billion people multilateral setting the same benign hegemon. And nothing could be worse maybe than a benign hegemon is one thing, absence of a benign hegemon could be another thing. And so that brings me to, first, congratulations on the idea of a commission to look at governance in the World Bank itself. And second, could you talk a little bit about how you see the bank's role and the IMF's role emerging in a world in which China, India, and so on will matter a lot more and may not be in quite the same way, quite as quickly, have the same self-interest in a global economic system that works as the U.S. had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. I see a role for the institutions that's very central there, but how to get between now, here, and then could be a very rough road. Any thoughts on that?
That's a very rich agenda. It's the heart of what a lot of this is about. And let me just, in a small way, connect your first point with your last point. As you may know, Nancy, the greatest resistance on our board for doing a carbon shadow price is from the developing countries who are fearful that we'll add a standard that developed countries don't have to have. And so they want to know why we would apply it to them. So it's a good example of how we need to nudge that process forward is information level, to share the information. And in a way, as one of the reasons I was making the suggestions that I was making today was sometimes if you're running into a problem head on, you might go around a little bit. And some of the things I was trying to talk about in the energy area might help address those topics as well. On your metaphysical question in particular, I've been giving a lot of thought to this over many years, and perhaps because I've dealt with military, political, security, financial, other issues, you've had different phases in the economic system from the military and security system for quite some time already. So the nature of multipolarity has been evolving in different ways. And again, part of my remarks today are to show how they're actually interconnected. Take the post-conflict and fragile states. As Adam was kind enough in the comments about the responsible stakeholder, I've long believed that the system has an interest in trying to encourage countries to recognize the benefits of the international system and assume greater responsibilities. It's frustrating, of course, but sometimes part of the frustration is they may have different views, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but they're theirs. And so you have to build this culture. And part of the reason I'm suggesting this and the types of things I did for the steering group is I've seen this in NATO context, the APEC context, WTO context, G7 context. Unless you start to build people sitting around the table and having that common set of responsibilities, you lose the likelihood. It's a matter of increasing probabilities of people sort of coming together. It doesn't ensure a solution. I was part of the Doha negotiations, and one of the big change of Doha versus the Uruguay round was the rising roles of some of the rising economic powers, and that challenge still has to be sort of fully engaged to be able to get that round done if it's going to be salvaged. But I think what one will be surprised with in some ways, I guess, is you can make more headway in this sometimes than people think. I've worked a lot with China over the years, and when I was with the State Department or with USTR, I found that China in particular is a country that is confident because of its success, but it's also very open to ideas. Now, the challenge is to cast the ideas, and this fits a little bit with the work that IIE has been doing, Peterson Institute, in a way that doesn't ask them to ignore their national interests, but to broaden their view of national interests and see the systemic interest of whatever the topic is. And I'm working on this right now with China on African development in the Pacific Islands, showing why things are in their interest to work with us and others, because otherwise it may backfire. Just two other points, because this could go on for a while. One, I do think there is still a key role, going back to Charles Kindleberger, who wrote about this in economics, was the idea of having sort of a principal player play that role. And I think, I don't say this just as an American, I say this as an observer, I think the U.S. is going to have to play that role if it's going to work. But that's why part of my message is, for two presidential candidates, as you fix up the current mess, you're going to have to think about how you deal with these multilateral issues. Ones where it's partly diplomacy, it's partly influence, it's partly how you move the process forward. That's going to be a big part of all the next president's job. The good news is, this is undoubtedly a difficult time, but what I've seen over 25 some years is that the resources of the United States, diplomatic, political, economic, are still enormous. And in many parts of the world, while you run into difficulties, people are looking for the U.S. to play that role. Now, how you play that role is quite significant, and how you, in a sense, build legitimacy into the system and come up with packages that have other people have influence, and that's sort of the devil in the details of diplomacy. And so I think that coming back to the last point was, you asked about the role of the World Bank and the fund. I do think there's a role for these institutions that have their own different nature to be able to help catalyze this effect as well. There may be things that the World Bank can do that no one country can do, but there's other things we can't do. And so that's one of the reasons, as I was suggesting, and I've talked about this with Dominique Strauss-Kahn, with the G7, G8, or whether it expands to a steering group, we could help identify issues. We could help shape some of the solutions. And then when it comes time to execution, we have our own implementing bodies. I have 185 members. So it gets a little complicated, but the network of pieces is there. And what I was partly trying to do today was to show how some of these relate to one another. And I do believe you need some sort of organizing group that helps pull together the dimensions. Just to give you another example, I was part of the 2+4 negotiations for German unification. That involved NATO, involved CSCE, involved. If you didn't have that group to help steer it, it wouldn't have happened. So you're going to need something like that, but building for the long term means you got to bring in some of these other players.
As we get into metaphysics, there may be limited time for additional questions. The gentleman at that table, please.
Thank you. Riyaz Naqshbandi, American University. Thank you. Could you please expand a little bit on your vision concerning the involvement of the sovereign wealth funds in Africa? In the meantime, can you give us a bird view of the proposed gap, which is generally accepted practices and policies concerning the sovereign wealth fund, which was, I think, planned or articulated in San Diego 2 weeks back? Well,
on the first question, At the time of our spring meetings, you know, I used a speech, I think, at the Center for Global Development, if I recall, to try to outline how we as an institution needed to adapt to changes in the international economy. And as I talked about today, you've now got shifts of pools to capital to sovereign wealth funds. And so whether you are what we used to call investment banks or an international financial institution, you look to play an intermediating role. So all those guys up in New York, believe you me, either they're running there to get recapitalized or to do the transactions. The core idea that I talked about in the spring was the 1% solution. It was just a way of framing that if you had about $3 trillion in sovereign wealth funds and you just invested 1% in sub-Saharan Africa, it'd be $30 billion. Now, the point, and I'm glad you've asked this was not an aid program, and it's not a charity. The idea is that if you look at the world of different asset classes, and you look at, I touched on this again, sort of local currency bond markets, commodity markets, some of you know how this works. If we could get these African equities into be part of a diversified portfolio, so with your risk and return assessment that you would have a certain allocation to this or some other poor countries in Latin America, you could do well by doing good. You could help them have good returns, diversification. You could help growth. And one of the things that I've mentioned in my remarks is, consider some of the growth prospects. Over 10 years, you've had 2/3 of the population of sub-Saharan Africa in countries that are growing on average 6.6%. That breaks down, there's about 8 that grow at 8.1% that are natural resource producers or oil. There's about 17 that grew at about 5.96% over 10 years. Those solid growth potential here. And so what we know is that with a lot of the sovereign wealth funds, they don't know these markets. And so they don't know how to take the risks or the transactions cost of information. We, through IFC, our private sector side, have been investing in these countries, and we've been doing increased, about 40% of our IFC work is now in IDA countries, the 78 poorest countries. And we've been building equity as opposed to loans. So we're developing an investment platform. And over the past few months, we've been talking to each of the sovereign wealth funds to try to get a sense of their interest. And we're now at the stage where I hope as we move towards the end of the year, we could try to get one or more anchor investors to move such a fund forward. And then if we can make it work, then again, part of our point of view is in a sense, how do we make markets work better for both parties? As for your comment on San Francisco, I'm not sure, you mentioned GAP. What I know is the IMF has been putting together a proposal that I think is still confidential, but they're going to be talking about at the IMF or at the annual meetings to try to deal with some of the political anxiety about transparency and governance positions of sovereign wealth funds.
Do you have time for one more, Bob? Yeah. Great. Anders?
Thank you very much for a great speech. I have a brief question for you. What do you think can and should be done to stop the current financial panic? What role do you see for the Bretton Woods institution in this regard?
The role of the Bretton Woods?
Bretton Woods institutions. And what do you accomplish in this regard at the annual meetings? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anders.
I think I prefer metaphysics. I just have to share with your audience, it's wonderful to see Anders here. When I was sort of a young undersecretary at the State Department in 1989, and we were seeing all the challenges happening in the then Soviet Union on the economic side, I was trying to find some anything good to read about the nature of what was going on with perestroika. And in the summer of '89, I came across in the bookstore this little-known book by a scholar named Anders Osland about the changes in Gorbachev's economy, which I read in August. And I met a Newsweek reporter afterwards who asked me, what are you reading? And Anders, they rarely do this. So I mentioned Anders Osland book, and which we both said it's too bad that I didn't get a share of the added sales. Which obviously, with the congressional action on the financial rescue in the United States, as soon as one can, and I know this is not an easy task, to start purchasing assets, getting price discovery. That will be a very important step. In the meantime, the central banks from around the world are trying to assure the liquidity, because as the confidence has been broken, it's reaching to other categories, commercial paper as well as interbank loans and things like that. To connect this to the G7 countries, I think in the short term, whatever they can do individually, but also to convey some sense that they're working together, will help restore confidence. Now, if you just think of my remarks, what I've suggested is I'm not really a fan of unitary systems. I like networks and flexibility. So what the policies preferably should try to be consistent with one another, and ones that are in concert with one another. They don't have to be one sort of big fund. So I think that what I hope the G7 will do is look at those sort of issues related to the information, the assets, their eventual recapitalization. I think they're already starting, but I would emphasize the need to do this, is that you're going to have a financial, or overall a financial regulation and supervision. Financial Stability Forum with Mario Draghi's made a start at this, but as I've said in my remarks, the problem's international. You're going to have a solution that doesn't allow regulatory arbitrage. So that's going to be a second point that at least they could point in commitment. Third, from the perspective of the developing world, which I need to emphasize, is that it's very critical that they not lose sight of the fact that I think we're at a tipping point for developing countries. So the first need is the food and fuel challenge. Of this $1.2 billion rapid financing facility, which we financed by ourselves, we've already committed, or in the pipeline, about $850 million of it. The Australians are putting in some money, others are considering it. We're going to need that sort of need for the most vulnerable, and we're talking about connecting that with the energy for the poor idea. But frankly, there's going to need to be a level beyond that. If given the dangers that some countries are going to have in terms of their balance of payments or other positions, I do think that the G7 and a larger group are going to need to be agile, working with the IMF and the development banks to deal with what might be financial crises for some countries. So I think it's also important that they emphasize that. And then, since you can't pack too much in, I think one of the reasons that I started the discussion on some of the things I've talked about was that for an Italian G7, G8 presidency, I hope they take on some of these questions, the climate change and the energy questions, where you're going to go with the trading system, their own membership. That would be a pretty full plate, but that's the direction I would point to, and indeed am pointing to. You also asked about the bank and the fund. I peppered in here different ways in which the bank and fund could play a role, and partly address that in Nancy's question. But take, for example, countries with balance of payments crises. Look, there's going to be a role for the IMF. Okay? People have sort of let the IMF, after the 97-98 financial crisis, sort of move out of the prime action. And what we found is some countries now want the bank to be the IMF. In other words, they want to work with the IMF, and I don't want to be the IMF. That's not our job. That's the role of the IMF. Now, I've got full faith in Dominique Strauss-Kahn that he can handle this role with the appropriate political sensitivity. One of my ongoing other jokes is I'm always paired with French socialists who bring skills that I don't have. And so we need to work with the IMF, and we are in the bank, very closely on those, but we can't do it alone. You're going to need to have other countries. And so coming back to even the question with Nancy asked, there are going to be Gulf countries that need to be part of this. In some countries where China has a relationship, you're going to have to be part of it, because balance of payments issues are, to me, you have to address in a way that also puts the country back on a path for sustainable reform issues. So that's the combination that all this is trying to point towards. And part of the role that I think, again, the question that both you and Nancy asked, in a way, one of the good roles of the international financial institutions is we're in a slightly different position than national governments. We can step back and try to see this systemically, and we can try to point to where there are gaps. I presented today something I just touched on, but there's a tremendous benefit if we could get countries to change how they do some of their humanitarian food support. We could probably save 20% for the World Food Program if we just got some longer-term funding and some credit, a line of credit and other things. And so that's what we can do, and if they incorporate us in these new processes, we will do.
Thank you very much.